anybody there?
Hello, hello. Good morning.
Good morning. Can you see me?
Hey, yeah, I can see you. A very festive audio
Thank
spot
you.
you've got there.
This is my little nook with the Christmas lights, and it makes me feel kind of like warm and cozy. So great to meet you.
Rather than in a dark box.
Yes. I feel that like I'm like sad enough as is, like I need some like cheering up with my lights
Yeah.
and everything.
I mean, seems pretty solitary.
That's right. So it's wonderful to meet you and a pleasure to
you
get
as
to
well.
check out your work. And without further ado, do you mind if we get this thing rolling?
Sure.
Do you mind if we start at the beginning? The internet tells me you're from Detroit. Is that correct?
Yeah, just outside of Detroit.
Okay.
It was interesting as I'm about to put out this book, Nature Trail Stories. I more so see my childhood in a very like industrial setting where there's not a lot of nature. My current way of life feels like a reaction in response to that, like seeking a little more nature, because I did not love the busyness of growing up next to a huge freeway, which was considered like America's Autobahn, and cars everywhere, everything gray. Like I did not find that particularly calming to my body or mind. But I definitely, it led me to appreciate little pieces of the natural world where they can be found.
Mm. So you feel like you're coming back full circle in some respects as you're putting together this work. That seems to be kind of where things are resonating with this collection.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and they're not all about like specific nature trails. Some of them are just about finding little bits of the natural world and like suburbs or in cities, and just little spaces that we make
Mm-hmm.
to find solitude and a little bit of escape from the noise of the human world.
Right. And that was one of the things that I wanted to talk to you a little bit later on, but I'm glad you bring it up now. In the first stories that I was reading, there was this very deep sense of an internal voice there was that sense of wanting to escape to a more peaceful kind of place. But I don't know if you referred to this in one of our emails, but you mentioned borecore. Can you tell me what that is? Because that was just such a peculiar phrase. I had never heard that before.
Yeah, I can't remember when that occurred to me, but I think some years ago when I started writing these kind of quiet stories where nothing really happens, quote unquote, but it's more so about internal conflict and reflection. I felt a little bit frustrated with myself because I was always reading about plot and wanting to write these novels that were more plot driven.
Mm-hmm.
But whenever I would sit down and write a story for myself, just because I felt the impulse to write it, it tended to be more of an internal, reflective and quiet story where there's not a whole lot of external conflict. It usually has to do with where the character's in a moment where they're reflecting back on their past, and that is reflected in the more quiet instances of observation of the natural world.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of just said that about my stories at one point in time, like to poke fun at myself, because I just was like, the pieces that I publish, I don't expect, all of my friends and family to find it like enthralling or exciting. It's not a Stephen King novel or anything.
Sure.
But it's what I enjoy writing, and it's also the kind of stories that I enjoy reading too. So I think someone said a while back that in another podcast interview that like you can't fight the kind of writer that you are, and like most people spend a lot of time fighting it when they're thinking about like the market or selling books.
Yeah.
And I certainly still would like to sell books. But if you are essentially making art for yourself and to find a better connection with the world, you can't really fight your own artistic impulses forever. So
Right.
this collection is kind of about finding that part of myself and accepting the fact that I'm a borecore author.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think I was listening to that interview yesterday. It was maybe the Other People interview that you
Mm.
did, which was a great conversation that you folks had, and I should probably put it in the episode description so folks can listen to you a little bit
Oh,
more.
thanks.
But I love this sort of proclamation, right, that one has to make of themselves, to say, this is what I do, this is my perspective, and the way that you own it here is really, really empowering and exciting. But it kind of, in a
Oh,
way,
thanks.
though, there's this beautiful honesty in the work that doesn't resonate with borecore. that is so,
Okay. All right. Cool.
it's, I love that there is a drive that is built in, that is not like an inherent Western plot, beginning, middle, and end,
Mm.
but there's ruminations that are deep, and they have their own questions. And at least the characters that I read, there was a grief, there was a loneliness, or perhaps there was something that they still needed to overcome in some respects. But the way that you went about it was, it didn't feel Western, you know.
Yeah.
So I'm curious of what you were reading when you first started writing, or what are some if there is a legacy of writer that you want to join, or maybe writers that inspired you to see the world in this fashion, or if this was very much what you fashioned on your own.
No, I definitely was influenced by other authors, I think. And as I've um, found more authors outside of, the Western canon or even contemporary American literature, I have felt some validation in the kind of stories that I like to read and write.
Mm.
I'm a fan of a lot of Southeast Asian writers. I love Han Kang. I love Sayaka Murata. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing these names. They're just like books that I find in the bookstore and pick up and connect to, but haven't, really studied in like an academic sense or anything. I just, it's just my own whims of what I like to read. But I have found that a lot of Japanese writers I tend to connect with more than American authors. I just read a really great book, Tokyo Ueno Station. And see, I wish that I had these right in front of me so I could reference the authors. But one of my goals for this year is to read more authors in translation. But I think the first writer who's, sort of like non-Western, this is an American author, but Ruth Ozeki is a Japanese American author. And I think I really connected to her writing as sort of the bridge toward non-Western storylines, where it isn't quite so hero's journey and using the character to fight against external obstacles, and not necessarily having to have the typical beginning, middle, end structure that we're really used to and that a lot of Western readers find satisfying.
Yeah. So could you give me an example of one of the stories in the collection that maybe you found a way into, or how one of those stories began, and if there is another semblance of structure, or if you see it in that way at all? Because clearly, we're not seeing a Western kind of structure, but what are the patterns that guide you as you're writing a story like this?
Usually it's just a moment in time where I have, I imagine something, usually based on an interaction that I have personally or that I observe. Like this second story, Boys to Men, that maybe you
Yeah, I
read since
love
it's
that.
an earlier one. Yeah, thanks. That one, I remember I got the idea when I was at, because I'm a teacher at a student's Christmas concert, and I was just like observing all of the families watching their children and, sibling relationships there.
Hmm.
And it just made me think about how fraught those sibling relationships can be, and how you really try to help your family. And it can be really painful and difficult when those who are in pain like don't want your help, but you want to help. And people don't always know how to help in the way that the person who they perceive to need help needs it.
Yeah.
And just how those dynamics could play out in a character. So that's kind of where I imagined that character, who is a singer, trying really hard to connect with his brother who struggles with addiction. And then the first story, Waiting, I mean, I think that's probably one that's pretty non-hero's journey type Western narrative arc, because it's really just about a woman at a nature center imagining things, and that's the whole story. And I was kind of cautioned against that being the first story, because it might be a little off-putting to readers who are like, oh, this woman's just imagining things, that's it. But that's the kind of writing.
But it's so wonderful. It sets the tone very early on, and you say, this is what it's going to be. This is really the energy that we're coming at this with. And that's what I applaud about this collection, that it really follows its own intuition. And I wish that we could do more of that as creatives, or at least pass that on to people, because like you were saying in maybe the other podcast, we feel like we have this responsibility to find the plot, to make it work on a mechanical level, rather than just being as true as humanly possible to the intuition that is making us an artist in the first place, or a storyteller. So if we can kind of expand for just a moment on how long it took to produce this book and really assemble these pieces over time, can you describe a bit of what that process was like, putting these stories together into a collection?
I was just flipping through it before we got on this call, thinking about, okay, which of these stories was actually the first that I wrote? And I think it was the story with Gun, which I wrote, I believe, like 7 years ago. And since then, I've definitely picked up speed with writing these nature trail stories in the last 5 years, since moving from Southeast Michigan to the Shenandoah Valley, and where there are a lot of mountains, part of the Blue Ridge Mountain. And yeah, I'm really blessed to be in a place where there's a lot of access to nature now. So that had me thinking about how I craved that in Michigan, and started writing more characters in these spaces. Because yeah, Waiting is based on a place in Michigan. Boys to Men is too. But I think I was just thinking about them more as I was spending a lot of time taking walks. And then when I noticed, it was probably 3 or 4 years ago, I noticed that I was writing all of these stories. I'm like, hey, why not? It started as like a joke on Twitter. I'm like, if I wrote a story collection of only stories about people walking on nature trails, like, that would be the worst career move ever, but now I kind of want to do it. Yeah, and I think a lot of good art starts as a joke. And so this kind of was like a joke, or like a challenge with myself in a way. So then I started more intentionally writing these stories over the last few years, with the aim to put them into a collection.
Oh, that's beautiful, because it does reveal something about the moment, right? Where you're like, this is too silly to actually make any impact, or too silly to be a thing. And as you say, usually that tends to be the stronger idea, because it's bold, out of left field. Yeah, and way more exciting to write than the thing that you're supposed to be writing, which
which ends up feeling a little hollow if you're trying to pursue some structure, follow, a guide. That you're reading about how to write a novel. I took an online writing class with Rachel Yoder like a year ago or so, and she said something like that too, like the ideas that sound the most ridiculous and like stupid are usually the best ones. And I don't know if you're familiar with her book Night Bitch. It's excellent.
No,
and
but
it's about a woman. Yeah, it's about a woman turning into a dog. And that's like, and she's a new mom, and she just becomes feral at night and becomes literally becomes a dog. And I
Wow.
think that was connected to her idea, like, oh, this is the most ridiculous idea, but it's this beautiful, like deep and emotional book, despite what a silly sort of premise it sounds like.
Oh, I can't wait to
I
check
love
it
that
out.
stuff.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
Especially when it delves into the absurd. I'm just like, I'm right there. That's where I want to live.
Yeah, same.
So speaking of the construction of the book and seeing these pieces come together, as you were putting this collection into one thing, you're also an educator. You're busy teaching a whole bunch. How does this gel together as you're making time to write and make this happen?
Well, I think that's where the short story form is really wonderful if you're a writer with another full-time job. Because I don't really, I've written a handful of novels, but mostly I write those during the summer. I mean, I'm
Mm,
very lucky to have summers off as a teacher. And that's when I can think about long-term story structure. But during the school year, I can only really write when I don't really force myself to write a whole lot. I don't write every day. It's just kind of when I get the impulse and when I get a story idea. And that, like we've said, is like usually what's the best is when you're following an impulse. Um, Putting it together was difficult. Like my last book, Whimsy, I was editing that during the school year as well.
oof.
And so that can be kind of draining. Like
Mhm.
um, I don't really talk about my writing like at work. Like most of my coworkers don't know I'm a writer, and
Mhm.
I don't really talk in my day-to-day life a whole lot about the balance of that. So sometimes I feel like I'm doing that in secret, and like
Yeah.
everyone thinks I don't really have a social life, and I'm like, well, it's because I'm working on writing all the time. But it's okay if you just think my life is really boring. It kind of is. So that's fine.
But it's a productive and fulfilling life in your own way, because I kind of feel the same
Yeah.
way, that you have to
Mm.
make concessions. At a certain
Yeah.
point, there's people that are not going to understand the journey of having to bring something forth, and that means not going out to hang out with somebody that particular day because this thing is due, or you gotta make sure
Right.
that it goes out into the world. But it's something that fascinates me because I've been of this mindset that there is little glory in the process, and everyone's expecting the output to be like this saving grace thing. But
Hmm.
as working creatives, we have to create our own sort of wins and the things that help us along the way. And I'm
Yeah.
interested in knowing what those things are for you, those little victories that allowed you to finish this, to make this a reality.
I mean, the little victories feel most victorious when it's really just like finishing a story and reading it again and being excited by my own writing. And I think that's probably the case for a lot of artists, like that the
Hmm.
best feeling is going back to your own art and feeling an emotional response to it. That's the most exciting thing.
Right.
Um I mean, of course, when you publish and you hear from folks who've read it and have connected with your writing, that's also amazing. I mean, really, those are the two best feelings, I think, like connecting with and exciting yourself and somebody else. But also just writing it too, getting a good idea is like the best high.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So, looking back on what came before Nature Trail Stories, you wrote a work called Whimsy. And going from a
Mhm.
novel, because that was a novel, correct?
Yeah, novella, so short
Novella.
novel. Hmm.
So, still a standalone project, going into
Yeah.
this next work. What were some things that you learned from the previous project that you brought on, or maybe some mistakes that you vowed not to make again?
Well, I've written like 3 other novels, which those I really plotted and tried to structure and sit down and work on every day and really crank out. Whimsy was those have not sold, those were not necessarily, um, I don't know, marketable or my best work. But I approached Whimsy differently because I started writing it as a collected or as a linked short story collection. So I think I just, as a writer, like I do better when I approach things as short pieces
Mm,
and looking at them as scenes. And that's kind of what I did when I was writing that novella. I mean, after I had a draft of the stories, I definitely filled in some gaps and thought about the overall narrative arc. But that was in some ways similar, but with a story collection where the characters are and the overarching storyline is not continuous. There's definitely more freedom in getting to explore different types of characters
mm,
and different types of scenarios. I was interested in challenging myself to try to write different types of characters, because if they're all on nature to be the same person, or that's going to get really boring and the same reality. um so that was different, but I would say in the actual writing process of sitting down and writing a story was pretty similar to how I wrote Whimsy. And it seems to be that I'm discovering that's kind of where the magic is for me,
mm.
um, which I think is really helpful when you figure out where you're
Right.
what's the way in.
Yeah. Was there a point in time when you were first getting started, or not just in this work, but maybe earlier on, that you stopped writing altogether, or a moment where you decided to step away from writing any time in your life?
I haven't really hit that point yet. Maybe I will. I'm trying to be at peace with the fact that it may come
Mhm.
and it probably will come, and that shouldn't mean that I'm never going to write again, because I've seen that happen with other friends who get really upset. I mean, certainly there's times when weeks will go by and I won't write, and
Mhm.
I'll notice I don't feel great, and even my husband will notice, like, you really need to write, like you're getting weird, you need to write to like help you be a functional and happy and calm person.
Right.
So for me, it is pretty therapeutic. So I kind of need it, whether I'm writing with the aim to publish or not. I haven't really gone through too many periods where or not very long periods where I stopped writing or I thought I would never write again. I've
Mhm.
certainly come through periods of frustration with the publishing process.
Mm.
Um, and considered like, oh, I quit, I don't want to try to publish anymore, I'm gonna keep writing, but screw this other BS because it's too frustrating. Yeah, yeah, it's real. And I think even the people we deem to be the most successful writers and artists, like, go through those periods. We just we don't always see them.
Yeah, and it's something that I think that is worth acknowledging on the podcast, and I ask as many people as I can, because it is difficult to walk away from something when it's a compulsion, when it's a need that is more than just, I'm going to get this thing so that I can get all the attention or whatever. It's an actual
Mhm.
physical need to do some writing. But I'm also glad that you mentioned publishing, because I wanted to ask you what the process of submitting this work was like, and what kind of ups and downs you experienced during that process.
Yeah, well, they're still ongoing because a couple of my most recent stories that are in this collection are on submission with some
Mm.
literary journals. So when I get rejections for those, I'm like, oh, shoot, these are about to be in a book in the world. Yikes. And of course, that, publishing in literary journals is super competitive and so subjective. Editors are usually volunteers and don't get paid for it and are combing through hundreds of stories in their own free time. So I try to take that with a grain of salt, but it can be difficult thinking,
Mhm.
anytime you get a rejection, it's hard not to have at least a split second of, oh, this is shit. you know.
Yeah.
Um, but and the publishing process, like, my road has been pretty meandering toward that. Whimsy was supposed to be published with an indie press in 2017, and then that press folded, and
Oh.
then ended up working with the editors who I previously worked with in this press, who started their own publishing company, and they ended up publishing Whimsy. Um, and then with Nature Trail Stories, I had submitted it just kind of like slush pile to some literary journals. I do have an agent, but it would probably shock no one that he was like, we can't sell this to like the big five market, at least,
Sure.
you know. So I was really lucky to do a reading with Josh Dale, who is the founding editor of 30 West, which is the indie publisher that's putting out Nature Trail Stories um, in last year. And so I interviewed one of his authors after that. And then he approached me and said, "Hey, do you have anything you want to submit?" And then I was like, "Yeah, actually, I'm working on this collection. What do you think? You know, I know this is pretty niche and not everyone's thing." So, but he was excited about the idea. So I feel very grateful to indie presses because they do make space for these stories that aren't as typical or formulaic as the big five really competitive publishing market sometimes demands.
Yeah, and it seems that you have a pretty level head about this, where you acknowledge the type of work it is, and then you say, this is not the type of work that will reach a whole bunch of people, or that needs to. I mean, it
Yeah.
has a specific, kind of need. But is that something that you've grown accustomed to when you recognize the writing as it comes out of you? Like you just say, this one may not really land in this particular market. This belongs somewhere else. I mean, because that takes a lot of self-awareness. I think a lot of us, we write something and we think it's gold, and it's going to go and do all kinds of stuff. But how does one acquire that?
I mean, I think it comes from experience. Like I've been I've been submitting my writing for publication for about 10 years now. And I think, yeah, every rejection you get comes with humility. And I also just try really hard not to think about publication at all while I'm writing. Otherwise, it does seem to flatten what I'm writing. And just go where the excitement is for me, rather than trying to anticipate what the excitement is for the market. Because also you can write a novel with the market in mind, and then it's not going to come out for several years, and we're going to be living in a different world. So if you write for the world, like the world's going to change faster than your writing can keep up. So that's definitely part of it. I submitted, or I applied to a few MFA writing programs over the years, and I have some of my closest writer friends have been in MFA programs, and I'm kind of grateful that I never got into one, because I think those I found writing community mostly online, which has been great. But I think in that sort of competitive environment, or it sounds competitive, at least from what I've heard from some peers, I think that's probably harder to keep a level head about it and not get too worked up about publishing or not. It also helps that I have a day job that I don't have to rely financially on my writing. So I think all of that together helps me to keep a level head and not put too much of my identity and ego reliant on my own career success, quote unquote, as we would typically consider artistic success to be.
I think that you've really articulated this so well, because I try to ask people, especially working class people, how they manage, right, the expectations of success and things of that nature. I was going to ask you later, but you covered that so well that I'm not going to ask you that again. But I do want to ask you about your work, your day job, and how that informs your writing, if it does at all. Do you think there are some lessons that you've taken in and they've made their way into the way that you work or in the stories that you tell?
Yeah, definitely. I've been a teacher in public schools for 10 years now. And I think it's always been an interesting experience because I think a lot of workplaces are their own bubbles and different industries. You mostly interact with people who are really similar to you. And I think, public schools are like one of the few places where they're microcosms of the community you're in, and you get
Mm,
to know every type of person that's living in your community. So I think interacting with students in that way, like that's really wonderful for like my perspective, I think, on my own career, but also just um, absorbing the world. Because if you're going to make art and going to write, like you need to interact with the world in some capacity. Otherwise, you're not really going to have anything to write about. Whimsy was about a teacher, so that was more directly inspired by my first couple years teaching. Now I'm a reading specialist at an elementary school,
mm,
and so I work with students who struggle to learn how to read, um, or have other reading difficulties or disabilities. So it's been really interesting. I've just been doing that for about a year now, but it is interesting to see how different people interact with text, and when it's frustrating, but also like even when you struggle to read, everyone loves story.
mm,
And so that's something that's interesting to me, and I think maybe also helps me be less precious about what the writing is like. Um, because I find it really abhorrent when people are like, um, I guess I don't know how to word that after using the word strong word like abhorrent, but um,
just let it
I
out.
find it off-putting when people are like pretentious and
Mm,
classicist about types of writing. And I see that also like working with kids. I see that in like the literary community toward more like genre fiction, but also toward kid lit, young adult authors. And I appreciate stories in every form. And I think that's probably in part influenced by my job, and that
mm,
I'm a, elementary reading specialist and not an English professor working with grad students or something.
right.
Um, so I also just like try. I love to try different things with writing too. I did write a middle grade novel this past year,
Mm,
like just for fun and just to try it. And because I noticed, especially after the pandemic, or well, the pandemic's still happening, but post those really interrupted schooling years, a lot of students are really struggling to learn how to read.
mm,
And we need more texts that are interesting to older students who are what we would think of as lower level reading ability. So that's something I'm interested in, and something I've been experimenting with is writing what are called like high-low books. So,
mm. So if I may
it,
pry on that a little bit, because this is such a
mhm,
fascinating topic, I think, are there ingredients, additional ingredients that would make, in your thinking, a successful,
mhm.
palatable book for this audience? What would that look like? Like what would it need to have to be effective?
For children who are just learning to read or struggling to read but are
Yeah,
a little bit older.
yeah.
There are some things that I've noticed in working with students who are learning to read, who are a bit older. And that is one thing that I integrated into this middle grade novel is when a sentence ends, the line ends and you go to another line. Because if your brain is working really hard to decode words, how they sound and their meaning, you don't have as much cognitive space for noticing punctuation.
Mm,
So students who are just learning to read, usually, they'll run from one sentence to another. So this is why picture books usually are at the end of a sentence. There's a whole space, and then you start a new sentence on a new line, or you don't
mm,
have a whole lot of text on each page. Also considering the font, like I know everyone loves to dunk on Comic Sans, but it's been found to be the easiest font for people with dyslexia to read.
Really?
Sans serif fonts, yeah. Serif fonts are really difficult, and when you look at also like, some of the letters like A or G are just different in some fonts. When you think about seeing that from someone who's just trying to learn letters and the sounds that are associated with those letters,
Mm.
That's just another obstacle. So there's really things that I think as adult readers or fluent readers, we take for granted that add a cognitive load to a new reader or a struggling reader. So those are a few things that I think of, but also just having older characters, but writing about their lives in simpler words.
Mm.
Because, I have some like fourth graders who were at the beginning of the year just learning the alphabet and the letter sounds. And now they're reading books, but the books I give them are from the first grade book inventory at our school.
Mm.
And they find they're embarrassed to bring those books back to class. So when I'm
Right.
with them, they'll read them, you know, this is the cat is on the mat, or about characters that are supposed to be 4 and 5 and
Mm.
they're 10 years old and nearly teenagers or preteens. They find that really embarrassing, and that's just another obstacle to practicing reading, and you got to practice reading to become a better reader. So I do think we need more books of that variety, especially in this day and age.
That is so powerful. And I think that it's definitely should be a call to action to people who are writing, who have the ability to tell stories like that, because it doesn't take
Mhm.
much for somebody who knows what they're doing to make that shift and look at that audience and see if there's something that could be done on a larger scale. Because we're not talking about isolated, people, or a small number of folks who are struggling with this, but
Right.
I imagine, I mean, in this country, it's
Huge.
got to be a lot of them, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and growing.
Yeah. So, wow, you're giving me ideas, but I anyway, let's focus on nature stories
All
here.
right, let me know when you write your book.
No, I would like to. I mean, it's an interest of mine because I've written children's plays that are more educational in nature, and
Oh,
and
great.
that's really kind of more my wheelhouse. But this seems
Yeah.
like a necessary thing to address. So it's
Mhm.
that's going to stick in my mind for a very long time. Um,
And if I could, add to that real quick, another thing that is an obstacle to those books getting to children is that, um, Big 5 publishers who, like Penguin Random House and, all the big whatever it is, Big 4 or whatever now, they do not publish those books.
mm,
I'm trying to publish this book because it does not fit within a certain age group. And the way the publishing industry is right now, they have expectations for the length of the book, the way the book looks,
mhm,
based upon the age group. And so if you're in an age group and you're not reading at that, expected age level, reading level, like if you go into Barnes and Noble, you're kind of out of luck
mhm.
trying to find a book that's going to be accessible to you. They have specialty presses that make decodable books, but those are mostly accessible to educators. And so if you're a parent and you're trying to find a book for your kid, it's going to be really hard. And I think that's adding to the frustration too, and adding to the sense of shame for parents and kids when their
Wow,
kids are struggling to read.
that is
I wanted to add that in there because I
yeah.
think that's a little known. Um, the industry needs to change.
Yeah, this is a massive issue. I mean, and you've really nailed it right on the head there. Something has to be done because it's not a small number of kids. This is a
Mhm,
majority of our children now in this country that are
mhm.
experiencing these difficulties. So, yeah, you've definitely burned that right in the back of my mind. So I'm gonna be, I'm gonna be definitely looking into that and seeing if there's any avenues or
Yeah.
possibilities. So, coming back to the work that you've put together, can you tell me of what the reception has been, or what how has it been received at this time?
Um, My new collection, or
Yes,
you mean my work in general?
your new collection.
Well, it's not out yet. So just
Oh, shoot.
I've only heard from blurbers and yeah, and folks with advanced copies. Um, but I think in general, I tend to kind of, I think this maybe aligns with this sense of like Western storytelling versus not. I think Western is also associated with the masculine. And I never really anticipated as many men liking my work
Mm,
as is the case. But I think, like we're all humans and we all have emotions. And I think we take for granted that men would connect with like sensitive narratives and introspective narratives. But I think that was the case for Whimsy and with the stories that I've published too. I've kind of like been pleasantly surprised at how many men have connected to my stories. That probably also has to do with the fact that as like a female author, you maybe feel a little bit pigeonholed, like what you write
mm,
is considered women's fiction. And so
yeah,
you don't think that you may be as available to getting readers who are not within your own identity group. And I know that's true for a lot of identity groups and minorities as well.
right. Oh, that's wonderful to hear. I definitely enjoyed, what I've read so far of the collection because, and I've said this before on the podcast, I think that some of us are looking for a language to things that we don't know how to really
Mm,
express. And something like this is so
mhm.
internal, very meditative, and that is something that men, unfortunately, are not given in this society.
Yeah.
And I think it's powerful in that way. To be mindful of your time, you've answered all my other ones really well. So I would only ask you, what would you say to somebody who's just starting out as a writer, who is doubting their intuition, who doesn't know where to begin or whether they should keep reading plot books or about structure rather than getting
Hmm.
things down on paper?
That's tough because I was just an English teacher and teaching creative writing classes to high school students. And I've had students and sometimes their parents inquire about careers in creative writing. And I don't know that I could, in good conscience, like encourage students to pursue it as a career. I think, if you pursue art, like do it for yourself first because there's so little control that you have over your ability to commodify and make money off of it. Um, so I think I would just say, like, read as much as possible. I know that's kind of an overused piece of advice, but it's so true. And read widely and see what you like and reflect on what you're reading, and then just write the stuff that you feel like you have to write. And that's, when I was giving feedback to young writers in past years, I just really tried to highlight what they were doing uniquely, like what was unique about their perspective, because especially when you're younger, you don't know what's different about your lived experience. You don't know what's different about your perspective. And it's hard to value that, especially at that developmental level when you just want to fit in. But making good art is like the opposite of trying to fit in. It's like trying to figure out why you're different and why what you have to express is unique and needs to be said.
I couldn't agree more. And that's a really awesome note to end on. So, Shannon, I want to thank you
Thanks.
for this reminder that we are okay following our intuition and being true to our perspective, and for the work
Mm.
that you've done as an educator, that is so important and, yeah, I mean, very necessary right now. And for this amazing collection, Nature Trail Stories, which is amazing so far. So I urge everyone to go check it out. It's something new, something refreshing, and it's the right thing to do. Go support indie creatives. Thank you, Shannon, so much. This has been awesome.
Thank you so much. Oh, it was so fun talking to you. I really, really appreciate it.
Wonderful. Well, I will let you enjoy the rest of your Sunday, but please take care, and I will bug you on the internet.
Yes, please do. Yeah, I would love to read your writing, especially for children. Like if I'm going to have to investigate how I can check out your plays. And,
well, I got to get them produced first, but yeah, really cool. It's been a while.
Well, you can email them to me.
We'll see.
I'd love to read them.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Shannon, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Talk soon.
Thank you. You too. Take care.
Bye.